We're looking back at this day in local history now as part of the Gray Media Initiative, We the People. 4 years ago today, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a decision in a Mississippi case that affected the entire country. The state's only abortion clinic at the time had sued the state health officer, Dr. Thomas Dobbs, to block enforcement of a new state law banning most abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. The High Court ultimately ruled that the Constitution does not protect abortion rights and that individual states should decide whether to allow the procedures. That resulted in a near total ban on abortion in Mississippi and a handful of other states. It remains a contentious issue with strong feelings on both sides. The U.S. Supreme Court issues its Dobbs decision on June 24th, 2022. Your look at this day in history.